So a few days ago, I said I was going to talk about politics here a bit, and that I was concerned about the fact that no one trusts the media anymore. And partly this is because you need media to solve any political problem. And we talked about the LA wildfires, which are ongoing. There's a new one north of LA now. And all of these things are connected. So the LA fires are exacerbated by climate change, or not completely caused by them, but they're going to become more frequent. And people don't actually care about climate change that much. I was looking at polling about this before the election. It's pretty far down the list. People are more concerned in this country about economics, cost of living, cost of healthcare. Immigration, I think, is often a proxy for economic concerns. It's kind of tragic because actually, if you look at the Pew Research issue polling, which they do year over year, just before COVID, something happened which I don't think had ever really happened. The concern for the environment and concern for economic issues, it started to almost intersect. It's like people were starting to feel good enough about the economy that they felt like they could focus on the environment more than they used to. So I think if it weren't for COVID, we might be in a very different world in that regard. So people don't care about climate change that much. It's a hard fact. And we are now stepping away from it in significant ways with the new Trump administration. He took us out of the Paris Agreement, and I think we actually have to reflect and analyze and understand, how did we get here? How did Trump get elected twice? How did he get reelected after supposedly, according to the mainstream media, he was such a terrible president and such a buffoon? I think this says a lot about the media and why no one trusts it. So I'm going to talk about traditional journalism, some political stuff that I think is related, partisanship, fact-checking, alternative media, social media. So with traditional journalism, I think it's always been problematic. If you look at old news clips, especially during wartime, some of them read very much like transparent propaganda. So it's not like there was ever a golden age where every newspaper was just the gospel truth. But journalism does have in its DNA a kind of aspiration where it has a civic function. It has a responsibility to the public interest. It is not just an ordinary commercial enterprise. You can phrase this classic responsibility different ways, holding special interests accountable to the public interest, speaking truth to power. I like the phrasing, telling the truth about things that matter. And this implies this idea that you have to tell the truth, and it has to be about things that matter. You have to take political and moral and social positions on what to cover and how to cover it. This is an essential role that journalism plays in society. And why does no one trust them? Why is the trust in traditional media declining year over year? And it's now in the 30s, in the ballpark of Congress, which is your typical benchmark for an institution that is not trusted. So how did this happen? One good place to start is an article, Media Mistrust Has Been Growing for Decades. Does It Matter? Published in October of last year, so just a few months ago. Someone I went to school with. His name's Jesse Holcomb. He's a professor of journalism at Calvin College. And he covers a lot of ground, things like the changing economics of the news business, polarization, partisanship. I agree with everything he says, but I just want to double click on one of the points he makes, which is that in the past 50 years or so, journalism became more highly educated and more concentrated in the coastal cities and became more aligned with the Democratic Party. I try to think of analogies for this because I think to some extent it's just kind of coincidence. Like imagine a country where the boating industry and the media industry ends up being co-located in the same regions just by chance. The media may start advocating for the rights of boat people more than people who don't like boats. So I don't think it's necessarily a conspiracy, but there is this confluence and alignment between the mainstream media and not necessarily real leftist politics or causes, but at least the Democratic Party. And I pretty much always vote Democratic. I think every important election I voted Democratic or Green or Independent. I don't think I might have voted Republican in some like very local race. So to some extent that suits me fine, the dynamic I just said. I'm not naturally inclined to notice it or to think it's problematic, but it just is. This decline in trust in the mainstream media over decades, since the 70s, it is across the board. It's Democrats, independents, Republicans, conservatives, everyone. But it is more skewed on the right. And I don't really blame them. I think it's hard not to admit that this is a problematic dynamic. But I think it's more than that. It's not just about the Democratic Party. One of the most important comments after the recent election is what Bernie Sanders said, and other people said it as well. The Democratic Party abandoned the working class, so the working class is abandoning the Democratic Party. What do you expect, right? I don't know of anyone that has real serious pushback to this, and a lot of people across the spectrum, leftists, mainstream Democrats, independents, conservatives, are like, yeah, I mean, it sounds about right.
And this is really where the Democrats' focus on joy was so appalling. It just seemed to be a complete lack of awareness about the extraordinary suffering that exists in this country. I think there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to talk about. But first, it's about really trying to understand what the actual state of life is in this country.
And you put these two facts together. The Democratic Party has been abandoning the working class ever since Clinton or so. The media has been aligning with the Democratic Party. And so you have this feeling that the media has abandoned the working class, right? The media is not looking out for the American people at large with the vigor that they could. And I want to say this carefully because these are broad brushstrokes. There are many journalists who are talented, sincere, hardworking, and doing the Lord's work in terms of covering stories that matter, advocating for people that need the media to advocate for them. So I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush, but I think this is accurate as a broad characterization of the whole media industry, that it has drifted Democratic, and that the media, the mainstream media and the Democratic Party have drifted away from the working class in favor of people with college education and or knowledge workers and or office workers. And free trade is a big part of this story. I don't think people on the left generally understand this. If you look up the Battle of Seattle, it was this big anti-globalization, anti-free trade protest. And it's hard to use these broad labels like left and right, but I think it was basically a leftist protest if you had to pick. And you fast forward a couple decades, and I will now hear from my friends who identify either as left of the Democrats or progressive, or they say things that probably could come out of the mouth of Milton Friedman about free trade and why free trade is good and protectionism is bad. And there is an excellent case for that. I'm aware of the economic case for that. I think it's respectable. It's a debate we can have. But there's something strange going on there. And this is how you get Trumpism, is that there's a huge chunk of this country that was consciously kind of written off by Clinton, Obama, Kamala Harris. They're just laying on the table, and Trump comes along and says what I think is essentially a leftist message. I'm going to advocate for your jobs by pushing back against unrestricted free trade combined with, China having their own industrial policy or trade policy that makes the problem worse. So how did we get here? We got here by Democrats in the media not caring about the jobs of ordinary people in the Midwest and all over this country. And that is not adequately appreciated. Especially in November and December, I was just watching a ton of leftist media to try to understand who is grappling with what happened, who is trying to understand how we got here. I don't think enough people are talking about what I just talked about.
I mean, you can't view those folks as garbage. In other words, Trump's support is totally understandable.
But the problem is a lot of Democrats have not stepped back and asked the question, why does Trump resonate with so many people? They're willing to wait in line, stand in the rain, attend rallies, door knock, put up signs, run over the hot coals for him. It's not racism and these kind of things that you heard Democrats like pat themselves on the back to explain it away. It's raw, cold policy outcomes that they think he's fighting for that others do not speak for. It's why he defeated Jeb Bush, everybody. He was against immigration, right? The country is now wrestling with, to what extent do we deal with the immigration problem? He was against the wars when it was totally unpopular, and he wins 80% of the vote in South Carolina. He was against trade when everybody had moved to the Reagan, Bill Clinton, free trade is good, open. It was all policy. It was all policy. And that is because people said, A, he said it, and B, he's not apologizing when people say that, the Wall Street Journal editorial page and all the intelligentsia is like, you can't do this. And he's like, screw you. I can do it, and I'll bring the gun to the fight, and I'll kick your ass. And he took everybody on, and he never apologized, and he got some outcomes. And I'll just say this lastly, because this fires me up, this whole conversation. There is a member of Congress, a Democrat from Michigan. I will not say her name because I don't believe this call was public. And she said that union members in her state right now totally for Trump. And she said that Democrats belittled changes to NAFTA. Oh, all he did was nibble around the edges. He didn't really change anything. And she said the union Democrats said to her, but what did your party try to do? He said he would do something. He did something. Was it 100% change? No. Was it 10% is better than nothing? What have you done to fight for our jobs every day?
So that's a big problem. Problem number one, I'm going to call that populism. And it's a loaded word, but I just mean political parties and the media should care about the American people at large in this country. In Canada, they should care about the Canadian people in general. Not just like a narrow political faction. The other issue is that it's kind of related. A lot of the media, not all of it, a lot of the media has become so partisan that they're just not honest anymore. And on the left, it's easy to dunk on Fox News. I think that's an old tradition to describe Fox News as propaganda and that they're not fair and balanced at all. They have all these smears, and I believe all that. And it's also true that MSNBC does that as well. And it's a corrosive thing to have in the media. This is a smaller example, but it's fresh in everyone's minds. I'm not trying to defend Trump. I'm trying to defend fairness and accuracy in the media. And there was this thing that happened where he made these off-the-cuff remarks about Liz Cheney advocating for war, and people in the mainstream media, the more liberal mainstream media, latch onto it and mischaracterized it as Trump advocating for Liz Cheney to be executed before a firing squad.
And the Drudge Report, Trump calls for Cheney execution. Yeah. And he says that she should have 9 guns trained at her face. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her. Firing squad, obviously.
Here. Look, I don't think you even need to call it fire department. He's saying quite explicitly and unambiguously that Liz Cheney should be shot, should be executed by firing squad. That is appalling. It is a small facet of the reasons why he's unfit for office, and the Republican Party has made a disastrous mistake renominating him.
And that was not what he said. It just wasn't what he said. I'm not going to play the clip, but if you go find the clip.
Is it weird for you to see Liz Cheney running against you with Kamala Harris?
Look, she's a deranged person. The reason she doesn't like me is that she wanted to stay in Iraq. She wants to, tough person. People get killed all over. She's real tough, right? They're not the tough people. But the reason she couldn't stand me is that she always wanted to go to war with people. I don't want to go to war. She wanted to stay in Syria. I took them out. She wanted to stay in Iraq. I took them out. I mean, if it were up to her, we'd be in 50 different countries. And number one, it's very dangerous. Number two, a lot of people get killed. And number three, I mean, it's very, very expensive. That's why we owe $36 trillion. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. When the guns are trained on her face. They're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy. But she's a stupid person. And I'd have meetings with a lot of people, and she always wanted to go to war with people.
It is clear from the context, as well as the specific words he used, that he was saying something that leftists have said, anti-war people have said many, 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 many times, right? Essentially, it's like, okay, it's easy to be an armchair general, and what if you were out there getting shot at? You wouldn't like it, would you, right?
This is exactly what hippies always said. This is exactly what peaceniks always said. This is Fortunate Son, the song. It's like, you know what? It's very easy to sit in your building and send young men to die.
And to say that, and he specifically said, what if we put her out there with a rifle, right? You don't have a rifle with you when you're being shot at by a firing squad. So it really doesn't require much analysis to understand what he said properly and describe it fairly. And they refuse to do that. And it's not good. It's not good because it's not true. It's not good because it further impairs the credibility of media in the eyes of many people, including me, who is on the left, people who are more politically moderate, independent. They see through this and it turns them off. And then it just kind of enrages people on the right. There's nothing good that comes of this. And yet they can't resist. They can't resist. And it's mystifying because it's not like there's so many valid things to criticize Donald Trump for. There's no need to make stuff up or distort things, take them out of context. In summary, people don't trust the media for many reasons. It's not a simple phenomenon. But part of it is that they stopped advocating and standing up for and caring about the American people at large, and stop being scrupulous with accuracy. So this is a deep hole that you can't fact check your way out of, because it's not just about facts. It's a deeper political and moral deficit. And what I would say to sum that up is, people don't trust your facts if they don't believe you care about them. Like if aliens came down and were, harvesting people's organs and put out a newspaper, there's no fact checking they could do. There's no PhDs they could bring on that would make me trust it if I think that they don't have my interests at heart, right? So if you want to work in media in America, you have to love the American people. You have to care about the American people. And if you secretly or not so secretly just have like disdain for a big chunk of the country, maybe what you're doing is just political marketing. And then we have the gorilla in the corner, which is social media. I'll try to be brief because people have said almost everything there is worth saying about social media. Basically, I think it's fascinating. I think social media is objectively fascinating, and many, many people find it very entertaining. If you think of Instagram, TikTok, Twitter as ways to generate short video that's pretty fun to scroll through, it's fascinating. It's easy to hate on. It's hard to make something better that people actually like. Keep that in mind as I criticize it. But social media is essentially engagement driven. It doesn't have cognitive or epistemological content. And this works for social media as entertainment because it's about keeping your attention and selling ads and so on. And so the result is, people like social media as entertainment, but no one really trusts social media as a source of reliable information about what's going on in the world. It was never designed for that, and the owners don't want that kind of responsibility. And I think we've all known that for years. It's especially believable right now because Facebook announced that they're going to stop doing fact-checking. Fact-checking on social media is its own can of worms. There are valid concerns around free speech there, but the point I'm making now is that social media companies basically want to exchange bits and bytes on the internet and sell ads against them, and they don't really want to have the responsibilities or be held to the standards that journalists are. And they have actually done some interesting work on that front. I think we should give credit where credit is due. If you look on the Facebook, content moderation pages, clearly a lot of work and thought has gone into this. So it's not like they're doing nothing or have done nothing. But my core point is that social media was not designed to be journalism or media. They've been reluctantly dragged into that responsibility over the years, and now they're kind of abandoning it again. So it's not a good situation because social media is kind of destroying traditional media. So that moral and civic function of media that I was talking about is in trouble. So that's the situation with traditional media. There's been growing this vast ecosystem of what you might call alternative media, and I've been keeping half an eye on it for years. But in a way, I'm very late to understanding it the way I think a lot of people are understanding it, right? I think in general, people on the left are going to be kind of the last to notice. So what is going on with alternative media? I'll mention one famous channel in particular called the Young Turks. And I'm mentioning them partly because they're pretty big. They've been doing this a long time, so they're kind of one of the early pioneers of alternative media. And I've seen them for years. I feel like 10 years or something. And I never really got that interested. And the reason was I perceived them as roughly the same as MSNBC. So I just didn't quite see the point, right? And that might not be a fair characterization. I'm saying what my casual impression was. But that's why I never really got interested. And it really was the Biden debate that did it for me. You see how decrepit he was and how unable he was to carry on a conversation. And it just seemed like, wow, the media has been covering for him and not doing their job. And now we're in a political crisis. We had a serious political crisis last year in this country because the media didn't do its job. So as that's happening, I tune into the Young Turks a bit, and it's night and day. The level of honesty and integrity on the Young Turks compared to MSNBC.
This thing's over. Joe Biden is a disaster, and nobody's even listening to anything he's saying. But Biden has no ability to counter it. And the whole time the split screen is killing Biden. Yep. Because he's got his mouth open, he looks confused, doesn't know where he is. So this is an epic disaster.
I think one of the interesting things that Alex said there was that some of the poor coherence and poor answers from Donald Trump are being viewed as standard Trump and therefore not newsworthy, while the performance from President Biden is being viewed as newsworthy because it came in below expectations.
Yeah, in any sort of normal universe, you would think the candidate who during the presidential debate said, "I didn't have sex with a porn star," was the loser of that debate. Yeah. That would be the normal scorecard. So let's just remember that so far, the only thing we've been concentrating on here is optics, that thing we call optics, and in this case also audio because of the aging voice of Joe Biden. But
so that's all I'm going to say on traditional media, except I want to mention a couple outlets. The Young Turks I mentioned, they're generally characterized as progressive or leftist, but also populist. I don't think I always agree with them, the host Cenk or the co-host Anna Kasparian, but I respect them. I respect their tenacity and vision for having been doing this for a very long time. Another channel I'll mention, which is more of a centrist or trying to be balanced program. It's called Two Way, and it's hosted by Mark Halperin, who's a longtime political journalist. I think there's two things interesting about Two Way. So one is it's essentially done on Zoom. So you can call in. I don't think a lot of places have call-in shows except for local radio. So I think that's cool. The other thing, though, is he has two co-hosts, one who's a Democratic strategist, one who's a Republican. For whatever it's worth, my 2 cents are that Mark and this program he's doing, Two Way, are closer to the American center, the center of the American political spectrum in 2025 than anything out there I'm aware of. And I say that with a lot of caveats. Centrism doesn't mean good. It doesn't mean correct. Centrism also doesn't mean middle of the road. You can, if you have left-wing and right-wing perspectives on the same show, that is kind of centrist in a way, or it's balanced. That's different from just trying to take the most middle of the road position on everything. So I'm not advocating for centrism. What I'm saying is that this program, I think, gives you a relatively accurate view of what is actually going on in the American political system versus other programs that I've seen. And I'm saying this partly as someone who grew up all over the country. I have lived in the North, the South, East, West, rural, suburban, urban areas, richer areas, less rich areas. I'm not used to watching a TV program where people are talking about politics and thinking, I think they actually kind of understand the country. They kind of have their finger on the pulse of the country, and I'm not endorsing where that is. I'm making a descriptive, empirical statement, not a normative statement about what politics should be. So I think it's worth watching Two Way sometimes, just to gut check what's going on. I don't see any real going back. I think we are transitioning away from these traditional institutions and towards a world where there are these independent shows popping up on YouTube, reporters moving to Substack, and it's just going to keep happening. So parts of this are good, but there is this problem, which is that we need journalism. We need real journalism. The Young Turks, I don't think they have the budget to do the kind of investigative stories that the New York Times can do or the Wall Street Journal can do, right? So we should not be rooting for the failure. We can't just go into a world where no one has the budget to do this kind of stuff anymore.